The morning I decided to bake a cake, I hadn't slept in 31 hours. That's the kind of detail I record, the hour count. The reason, the way my left eye starts twitching around hour 26 like a telegraph operator sending a message nobody asked for. I'd been up because one of my heifers had gotten herself tangled in a wash gully during a thunderstorm, and by the time I'd dragged her out, reset the fence she'd broken through, and walked the perimeter to make sure the rest of the herd hadn't followed her lead into stupidity, the sun was already sitting fat and orange over the Chiricahua Range, and I was standing in my kitchen realizing I'd forgotten to eat for most of a day. I opened my ledger the way I always did in the mornings. Not for cattle counts, I'd get to those. But for the other column, the one I'd never shown anyone and never would, because a 34-year-old man keeping notes on which neighbor sneezed on what date is the kind of thing that gets you talked about in a small territory, and I was already talked about enough. Clara Whitfield's birthday was in 2 days. I set the ledger down on the table and stared at the entry. I'd written it 14 months ago, standing in Harlan's general store, pretending to examine a tin of peaches while Clara told Mrs. Harlan that she always thought August was the cruelest month for a birthday because everyone was too busy with the late summer work to remember. She'd laughed when she said it. That kind of laugh that isn't a laugh at all, it's a door closing behind someone's eyes. I'd bought the peaches, went home, wrote it down. And now here it was, circled in pencil, and I was thinking about cake. Let me say something about Clara Whitfield before I go any further, because you'll need to understand what kind of woman she was to understand why what happened mattered the way it did. She came to the San Simon Valley in 1872 with her husband, Dale Whitfield, a man I'd describe as earnest in the way a fence post is earnest, upright, functional, not much for conversation. They'd bought 60 acres east of my property, land that looked promising in spring and broke your heart by August. Dale worked it hard. Clara worked it harder. I know this because I could see their place from the ridge above my north pasture. And more often than not, it was Clara out there with the mule and the plow while Dale rode into town for supplies that took him 3 days to bring back from a store that was 4 hours away. Dale died in the winter of '74. Pneumonia, they said, though I'd seen him coughing blood into his handkerchief for 6 months before that, and everyone had pretended not to notice. Clara buried him herself. I know this because I rode past on the day she did it, and I saw her standing over a mound of fresh dirt with a shovel in her hands and her hair stuck to her face with sweat, and I almost stopped. Almost. I wrote in my ledger that night, Dale Whitfield buried. Clara dug the grave alone. I should have helped. I didn't. There are entries like that throughout my ledger. The should-haves. They're the ones I read most often, usually around 2 in the morning when the coyotes are going, and the house feels like it was built for someone who isn't me. After Dale died, the town treated Clara the way small communities treat young widows, with a strange combination of pity and avoidance, as if grief were something you could catch from standing too close. The women brought food for a week, then stopped. The men offered to buy her land, gently at first, then with less patience. Clara refused every offer. She kept the 60 acres. She ran 12 head of cattle and a kitchen garden, and she patched her own roof, and she did it all without asking anyone for a single thing, which in a territory like this is the surest way to make people stop offering. By the time a year had passed since Dale's death, Clara Whitfield had become a kind of ghost. People knew she was there. They mentioned her sometimes, poor Clara, always poor Clara, as if the word poor was her Christian name, but nobody visited. Nobody rode out to check the fence line or ask if she needed feed or just sit on her porch and talk about nothing the way people do when they remember that other people are real. Nobody except Nayland. I need to tell you about Nayland carefully, because I didn't understand her for a long time, and I don't want to make the same mistake in the telling that I made in the living. Nayland was Chiricahua Apache. She was maybe 50, maybe older. I never asked, and she never said, and I'd learned enough by then to know that asking an Apache woman her age was roughly as welcome as asking a rattlesnake to hold still while you measured it. She lived with a small group, her daughter, her daughter's husband, 2 grandchildren in the hills southeast of Clara's property. They'd been there longer than any of us, longer than the town. Longer than the territory lines someone in Washington had drawn on a map they'd never walked across. I first saw Nayland at Clara's ranch about 6 months after Dale died. I was on the ridge. I rode the ridge most mornings, telling myself it was to check my north fence, knowing full well I was checking on Clara, and I saw 2 figures on her porch. Clara sitting on the step and Nayland standing at the edge of the porch with a basket. They were talking. Or rather, Clara was talking, and Nayland was listening with that particular quality of attention I'd come to associate with the Apache I'd encountered. A listening that was full-bodied, that involved the shoulders and the hands and the angle of the head, not just the ears. I watched for maybe 5 minutes. Then I saw something that changed the way I understood Clara Whitfield entirely. Clara laughed, not the general store laugh, not the door-closing laugh, a real one. Her head went back and her hand came up to cover her mouth and her whole body shook with it. And Nayland's face. I couldn't see it clearly from that distance, but I could see the shift in her posture, the slight settling, the way you stand when someone you care about has finally let go of something heavy. I wrote it down that night. Clara laughed today, real laugh. Nayland was there. I have not heard that sound from her before. Over the following months, I saw Nayland at Clara's place regularly. Sometimes she brought food, dried meat, mesquite cakes, things from the hills that Clara wouldn't have known how to find. Sometimes Clara gave things in return, cloth, salt, once a pair of boots that must have been Dale's, but mostly they just sat together. Two women on a porch in the territory, speaking across a distance that most people in town would have said was uncrossable, and doing it as naturally as breathing. The town didn't approve. I heard it at Harlan's store, at the farrier's, at Sunday service when Clara stopped coming, and people used her absence as permission to discuss her openly. "Mixing with savages," said Mrs. Harlan, who had never walked a mile in any direction that didn't lead to her own front door. "Unnatural," said Bill Driscoll, who hadn't spoken to his own brother in 11 years over a land dispute about a creek neither of them used. I sat in those conversations and said nothing. That's another thing I recorded in my ledger, the nothings. The silences where I should have spoken. But I'm getting away from the cake. August 4th, 2 days before Clara's birthday, I was standing in my kitchen, which was not really a kitchen so much as a corner of my cabin where I kept a stove, a skillet, and a deep suspicion of anything that required more than 2 ingredients. I had never baked a cake. I had eaten cake maybe 4 times in my adult life, each time at someone else's table, each time with the vague awareness that the thing had been produced through a process I did not understand and did not intend to investigate. But the ledger entry was staring at me, and behind it all the other entries, the should-haves, the almosts, the times I'd watched from the ridge and done nothing. I got dressed, saddled my horse, rode into town. Harlan's general store was the only place within 30 miles that sold flour in quantities smaller than a wagon load. And Harlan himself was the kind of man who remembered everything you'd ever bought and would remind you of it at the worst possible moment. I walked in and tried to look casual, which for me meant standing very still and blinking too much. "Morning, Caleb," Harlan said from behind the counter. He was sorting nails into jars, which he did whenever he was bored, which was always. "Need something." "Flour," I said. "Got flour, how much?" "Enough for a cake." The sorting stopped. Harlan looked at me over his spectacles with an expression I can only describe as medical concern. "A cake? Yes. You're going to bake a cake." "That's what I said." "Caleb, I've known you 7 years. I've never seen you buy anything that wasn't salt, coffee, ammunition, or fence wire." "Well," I said, "today I'm buying flour." He sold me flour, sugar, 2 eggs from his wife's chickens, a small tin of vanilla extract that cost more than a decent saddle blanket, and a look of undisguised curiosity that I pretended not to notice. I also bought a tin of baking powder after he asked me if I had any, and I stared at him as if he'd spoken a foreign language. Walking out, I passed Mrs. Harlan coming in. She glanced at my parcels, and then at me with the sharpness of a woman who had made it her life's work to know everyone else's business. "Baking something, Mr. Dunn?" "No, ma'am. Just stocking up. On vanilla extract." I got on my horse and left before she could ask anything else. The ride home took 4 hours because I went the long way, past Clara's property, the way I always did when I was pretending I wasn't doing exactly that. She was in her garden, kneeling between rows of beans, pulling weeds, her back bent in that particular way that people's backs bend when they've been doing the same motion for hours and their body has stopped complaining and started just accepting. She was wearing a blue dress, faded, patched at the elbows, but blue. She always wore blue. I'd noted it in the ledger. Clara favors blue, the particular shade of the sky about 20 minutes before full dark. I rode past without stopping, I always rode past without stopping. That night I attempted the cake. I should record for posterity that the first attempt resulted in something that looked like an adobe brick and tasted like a punishment. I stood in my kitchen at midnight, staring at this object, and I thought very seriously about abandoning the entire enterprise and going back to being the man who watched from the ridge and wrote things down and never, not once, did anything about any of it. But then I looked at the ledger open on the table, not the birthday entry this time, another one from months ago. March 14th, saw Clara carrying water from the creek, 2 buckets on a yoke. She stopped halfway up the hill and just stood there, not resting, not catching her breath, just standing, like she'd forgotten why she was walking. Like the destination had stopped mattering. I'd seen that look. I knew it. I'd worn it myself after my mother died and left me the ranch and the ledger habit and the bone-deep inability to say what I was feeling to anyone who might actually hear it. I threw the first cake out to the chickens who ate it, because chickens have no standards, and I started again. The second attempt was worse. The third, around 3 in the morning, was something. Not good, but something. It held together. It had a shape that was approximately round. It tasted like sugar and flour and effort, which I decided was close enough. I set it on the table under a cloth and sat down beside it and stared at it for a long time, wondering what exactly I thought I was doing. I opened the ledger to a fresh page. Wrote August 5th, 3:47 a.m. Cake made, edible, possibly. What am I doing? I don't know. I know her birthday is tomorrow and nobody will remember it, and I cannot stand the thought of that. I cannot stand it. The next morning, August 5th, one day before her birthday, I rode to the ridge and looked down at Clara's place the way I'd done 100 times. Smoke from her chimney. The mule in the corral. Laundry on the line, 2 dresses, both blue, one so faded it was almost white. But something was different. There was another figure at the ranch. Not Clara, Nayland. Nayland was sitting on the porch, and Clara was beside her, and between them on the step was something that glinted in the morning light. I couldn't tell what it was from that distance. A jar, maybe. A tin. I watched them for a while. They weren't talking. They were just sitting together in that particular silence that people share when they've moved past the need for words, when presence itself has become the conversation. I felt something then that I'm going to try to name, even though I know I'll get it wrong. It was the feeling of wanting to be included in something you have no right to. The feeling of watching warmth from the outside and knowing that the glass between you and it is one you built yourself, brick by brick, year by year, every time you rode past without stopping. I rode home, looked at the cake, looked at the ledger, looked at the small wooden box on the shelf above my bed, the one I hadn't opened in 3 years. My mother's ring was inside that box. It was nothing fancy. A thin gold band with a small turquoise stone that my father had bought from a Navajo silversmith in Tucson the year before he married her. My mother wore it every day of her married life and every day of her widowed life after that, and when she died, she told me to give it to someone who made me feel like the world had a point to it. I hadn't opened the box because I hadn't met anyone who made me feel that way. That was a lie. I had met someone. I'd been watching her from the ridge for 2 years and writing about her in a ledger and riding past her property with my heart doing something uncomfortable in my chest, and I had never once had the courage to stop and say hello. I opened the box. The ring sat in a fold of cloth, small and simple and catching the light from the window. The turquoise was the color of Clara's dresses. I hadn't noticed that before. Or maybe I had, and I'd chosen not to notice, because noticing would mean admitting something I'd been keeping in the margins of my ledger for months. I closed the box, put it in my pocket, sat down at the table. Wrote August 5th, 11:20 a.m. I have the cake. I have the ring. I do not have anything resembling courage. But I think if I wait another year, I will become the kind of man who waits forever, and I have seen what that looks like, and I cannot. I stopped writing, because the next word would have been bear, and putting it down in ink would have made it true, and I wasn't sure I was ready for it to be true. But I put the ring in my pocket, and that night I didn't sleep, not from work this time, from the particular kind of terror that comes from deciding to stop being invisible. Dawn of August 6th came in gray, which I resented personally. A woman's birthday should have sun. I wrote this complaint in the ledger, then closed it because I was stalling. The cake was on the table. I'd wrapped it in a clean cloth, the cleanest thing I owned, a square of white cotton I'd been saving for reasons I couldn't remember. The ring was in my vest pocket. I could feel it through the fabric, a small weight that felt far heavier than gold and turquoise had any right to feel. I saddled the horse, put the cake in a saddlebag, which I then second-guessed, so I took it out and held it in my hands, which I then second-guessed because you can't hold a cake and steer a horse at the same time. So I put it back in the saddlebag and decided to ride slowly. 3 miles, that's all it was, 3 miles between my place and Clara's. I'd ridden it 100 times, past it, around it, along the ridge above it, but never to it. Never straight down the road to her gate, in plain view, with a cake in my saddlebag and a ring in my pocket and my heart doing something it hadn't done in years, which was working properly. I was halfway there when I stopped. Not because of doubt, though there was plenty of that, because of something I saw on the road ahead. Nayland. She was standing at the junction where the trail from the hills met the main road, just standing there as if she'd been waiting. She had a bundle under one arm, wrapped in deerskin, tied with sinew, and she was looking at me with an expression I couldn't read. I stopped my horse. We looked at each other. I had spoken to Nayland perhaps 3 times in my life, always briefly, always at Harlan's store, always with the awkward formality of 2 people who had no shared language and too much shared geography. But she knew who I was. I was certain of that, and I had the sudden, uncomfortable feeling that she knew exactly where I was going and why. "Morning," I said, because I am not good at silence and even worse at being seen. Nayland looked at my saddlebag, then at me. Then she did something I did not expect. She smiled. It wasn't a large smile. It was the kind of smile that happens mostly in the eyes, that rearranges the lines of a face into something that says "I know" without saying a single word. She turned and began walking toward Clara's ranch. Not on the road, on the trail that cut through the scrub alongside it, the trail she always used. She didn't look back. She didn't wait for me. But she'd smiled, and in that smile was something I can only describe as permission. Not to approach Clara. Clara didn't need anyone's permission to be approached. Permission to stop being afraid. I sat on my horse for a long moment, watching Nayland move through the brush with the unhurried confidence of someone who knew exactly where they belonged in the landscape. Then I nudged the horse forward and rode toward Clara Whitfield's ranch for the first time in my life. The gate was open. The mule looked at me with the mild contempt that mules reserve for everyone. And on the porch, standing up from where she'd been sitting with a cup of something in her hands, squinting against the gray morning light, wearing a blue dress the color of. She didn't recognize me at first. That's the detail I keep coming back to, the one I've turned over in my mind more than any other. That I had spent 2 years watching this woman from a ridge, writing about her in a ledger, memorizing the way she moved through her days, and when I finally rode up to her porch, she looked at me the way you look at a stranger who might be lost. "Can I help you?" she said. Her voice was lower than I expected. I'd heard her speak at the store, but always from a distance, always muffled by other conversations and the sound of my own cowardice. Up close, it was steady and careful, the voice of a woman who had learned to measure her words because she discovered that most people weren't listening anyway. "I'm Caleb," I said, still on the horse because I had apparently forgotten how dismounting worked. "Caleb Dunn, I have the ranch north of here." Something shifted in her face. Recognition, but the slow kind, the kind that has to travel through layers of not expecting anyone before it reaches the surface. "Mr. Dunn," she said, "you ride the ridge." I felt the blood come into my face so fast I thought it might come out the other side. She knew. Of course she knew. You don't spend 2 years riding the same ridge above someone's property without them noticing, no matter how subtle you think you're being. I was as subtle as a barn fire. "I do," I said, because there was nothing else to say. "Every morning," she added, not accusing, not angry. Just stating it the way she might say the sun rises or water's wet. A fact about the landscape. Caleb Dunn rides the ridge. "Yes, ma'am." She took a sip from her cup, watched me over the rim. Her eyes were brown. I'd noted this in the ledger, but I'd gotten the shade wrong. I'd written brown like good soil. But up close, they were darker than that, with flecks of something lighter near the center, like the last ember in a fire that's gone to ash. I sat on my horse. She stood on her porch. The mule chewed grass with the aggressive indifference of an animal that has never once cared about human awkwardness. "I brought you something," I said. She set the cup down, very slowly, the way people set things down when they're bracing for something. I realized with a lurch of shame that a strange man showing up at a widow's ranch unannounced saying, "I brought you something," could mean a great number of things, most of them unwelcome. "It's your birthday," I said quickly. "I brought a cake." The silence that followed was unlike any silence I have experienced before or since. It had a physical quality to it, a weight, a texture, like something you could reach out and touch. Clara Whitfield stood on her porch and stared at me, and I watched something move through her face that I cannot fully describe. Surprise, yes, but under it something rawer, something that had been sitting in a quiet room for a very long time, waiting for someone to knock. "How did you know that?" she asked. Her voice had changed. Still steady but thinner, like a wire pulled tight. "You mentioned it once, at Harlan's last year." "I mentioned it once." "Yes, ma'am." "And you remembered." I almost told her about the ledger. Almost told her that I hadn't just remembered, I'd written it down, circled it, underlined it, checked it against the calendar every month since. But I understood, in a rare moment of social intelligence, that this was not the time for that particular revelation. "I have a good memory for dates," I said, which was both true and a wild understatement. Clara Whitfield pressed her lips together. Her hand came up not to her mouth, not to her eyes, but to the side of her neck, where she pressed her fingers against the skin as if checking for a pulse, as if making sure she was still real. Still here, still a person whose birthday someone had remembered. "Get off your horse, Mr. Dunn," she said. I dismounted. My legs were shaking. I attributed this to the ride and not to the fact that I was standing 12 feet from a woman I'd been silently in love with for 2 years, holding a saddlebag that contained a cake of questionable structural integrity. I should tell you about the porch, because that's where everything happened. It was small, maybe 8 feet by 6, built of rough-cut pine that had weathered to the color of old bone. The boards were uneven. One of the posts had been replaced, recently, by the look of it, the new wood still pale against the gray of the rest. Clara had done that herself. I'd watched her do it from the ridge 3 months ago, and I'd written. Clara replaced the porch post today. It took her 4 hours. She hit her thumb with a hammer twice, and both times she said something I couldn't hear, but the mule flinched. There were 2 chairs on the porch. Not matching. One was a proper rocking chair, scarred and worn, and the other was a stool made from a barrel that someone had cut in half and sanded smooth. Between them a crate turned on its side, serving as a table. On the crate, Clara's cup, a book with a cracked spine, and a jar of wildflowers, yellow and purple, the kind that grew in the washes after summer rain. Someone had put those flowers there. Not Clara, I'd never seen her pick wildflowers. Nayland, I thought. Nayland had been here this morning. Clara led me to the porch the way you lead someone into a church, carefully, as if the space required reverence. She pointed to the barrel stool. I sat. She took the rocking chair but didn't rock. We faced each other across the crate with its flowers and its book and the space between 2 people who had been alone for too long. I took the cake out of the saddlebag. It had survived the ride better than I'd expected, which is to say it was still approximately round and hadn't disintegrated into components. The cloth wrapping had a small grease stain on one corner that I desperately hoped she wouldn't notice. I set it on the crate and pulled the cloth back the way I imagined a baker might, with a slight flourish, as if I had any idea what I was doing. Clara looked at the cake. It was not a beautiful cake. Let me be clear about that. It was lopsided, slightly sunken in the middle, and a shade of brown that suggested I'd left it in the oven either too long or not long enough. I still wasn't sure which. I'd attempted to dust the top with sugar, which had melted in the heat during the ride and now formed a thin crust that looked like desert frost. Clara looked at the cake for a long time. Then she looked at me, then back at the cake. "You made this," she said. "I did." "You, Caleb Dunn, who buys salt, coffee, ammunition, and fence wire, baked a cake." I blinked. "How do you know what I buy at Harlan's?" The faintest shadow of a smile crossed her face. "I have a good memory for details." Something happened in my chest that I can only compare to a fence post being pulled out of ground it's been set in for years. A sudden, lurching release, painful and freeing at the same time. She'd been watching me too. Not from a ridge, maybe, not with a ledger, but she'd been noticing, holding onto small things, the way I did. "I also brought coffee," I said, because my emotional capacity had been exhausted and I needed to retreat to familiar territory. "Thank God," she said, and this time the smile reached her eyes. I made coffee on her stove while she sat at the kitchen table. and watched me with an expression I couldn't name. Her kitchen was small and organized with the ruthless efficiency of someone who couldn't afford to waste anything. Not space, not time, not the energy it took to look for a pot that wasn't where it should be. Everything had its place. The cups hung from nails on the wall. The flour tin sat next to the salt tin sat next to the sugar tin, each labeled in neat handwriting. A rifle leaned against the wall by the back door, clean and oiled and within reach, which told me everything I needed to know about how Clara Whitfield slept at night. "Mr. Dunn. Caleb. Caleb, why are you here?" I kept my back to her, watching the coffee. It's easier to be honest when you can't see the face of the person you're being honest with. Cowardly, maybe, but easier. Because nobody should spend their birthday alone. I've spent the last 3 alone. I know. And you came now, this year. Yes. Why now? The coffee was ready. I poured 2 cups, set one in front of her, wrapped both my hands around mine. The warmth steadied me. I sat down across from her at the small table and looked at her, really looked at her, the way I'd never allowed myself to from the ridge, because looking at someone from a distance is safe, and looking at them across a kitchen table is the most dangerous thing you can do. She had lines at the corners of her eyes that I hadn't seen from far away. A scar on her left hand, small and white, running from the base of her thumb to her wrist. A knife slip, probably, or a wire cut, or one of the 1,000 small injuries that frontier life hands out like calling cards. Her hair was dark, pinned back loosely with a few strands escaping at her temple. She was not beautiful in the way that word usually means. She was beautiful the way a well-made tool is beautiful, the way a thing that has been used hard and maintained carefully and refused to break has a kind of grace that no ornamental thing will ever match. "Because I'm tired of riding past," I said. She held my gaze. I held hers. Somewhere outside, the mule made a sound that might have been editorial commentary. "You should have stopped sooner," Clara said. "I know. I've been watching you ride that ridge for 2 years, Caleb. 2 years. I kept waiting for you to come down. I kept writing in my ledger that I should." Her brow furrowed. "Your ledger?" I closed my eyes. I had not meant to say that. The ledger was the one thing, the one absolutely private, never-to-be-shared thing. And I had let it slip out like spilled water because this woman was sitting across from me and her eyes were doing something to my ability to filter my thoughts. "I keep a ledger," I said, resigned. "Most ranchers keep them for cattle and weather. I keep mine for other things." "What other things?" "People, dates, things I notice." Clara set her cup down, very quietly. "You wrote down my birthday." "Yes. What else did you write down?" I could have lied. I could have said just the birthday and she might have believed me or she might not, but either way the ledger would have remained safely abstract, a harmless quirk rather than the full-bodied confession it actually was. But I was tired. Tired of the ridge, tired of the almost, tired of being the man who wrote things down instead of doing them. So I told her. "I wrote down that you wear blue, that you replaced your porch post in May and it took 4 hours, that you laugh, really laugh when Nayland visits, that you stood on the hill with your water yoke in March and just stopped, and I couldn't tell if you'd forgotten where you were going or if you'd decided it didn't matter, and either way it was the saddest thing I'd ever seen." The kitchen was very quiet. The stove ticked as the metal cooled. Outside, a quail called from somewhere in the scrub, 2 sharp notes and a trill, the sound the desert makes when it's not trying to kill you. Clara's hand was flat on the table. I watched her fingers press into the wood. Her eyes were bright, not with tears, not yet, but with the effort of holding them back. "Nobody sees me," she said. Her voice was still steady, but barely. "The town sees poor Clara, the widow, the woman who won't sell. They see a problem or a pity. They don't see me. Even Dale was a good man, but he saw the ranch. He saw the work. He saw what needed doing. He didn't see." She stopped, pressed her fingers harder into the table. "You saw me standing on a hill," she said. "Yes." "And you wrote it down." "Yes." "Because it mattered to you. Because you mattered to me." I said it without planning to. The words came out the way a horse breaks through a fence, suddenly, with force, leaving damage behind them that can't be undone. I sat in Clara Whitfield's kitchen and felt the sentence land between us on the table like something physical, something that now had to be dealt with. Clara looked at me. I watched her face do what faces do when they're processing something too large for a single expression. A flicker of surprise, then something softer, then the careful reassembly of composure that people learn when they've been alone long enough to forget that composure isn't always necessary. "The cake," she said after a moment. "Let's have the cake." We ate cake on the porch. It was not good cake. I want to be clear about this again. The texture was somewhere between bread and mortar, the sweetness was uneven, too much in the center, not enough at the edges, and the sugar crust had achieved a consistency that required genuine jaw effort. Clara ate a full piece without comment, which I interpreted either as politeness or as evidence that she'd been eating her own cooking alone for so long that her standards had adjusted. But she ate it, and I ate it, and we sat on her porch, me on the barrel stool, her in the rocking chair, and we watched the gray morning slowly brighten as the clouds thinned over the mountains, and neither of us said anything for a long time, which was the most comfortable silence I had experienced in years. It was during this silence that Nayland appeared. She came from the trail through the scrub, the same way she always came, carrying the deerskin bundle I'd seen her with on the road. She walked to the porch, climbed the 2 steps, and set the bundle in Clara's lap without ceremony, the way you hand something to someone you've been handing things to for years. Clara unwrapped it. Inside was a pair of moccasins. They were beautiful, soft deerskin, worked smooth, with a pattern along the tops in tiny beads of blue and white. The beadwork was precise and intricate, the kind of work that takes not just skill but time, the kind of time that means someone has been thinking about you while their hands were busy. Clara held the moccasins and stared at them, and this time the tears came. Not loudly, not dramatically. They just came, rolling down her face while the rest of her stayed perfectly still, as if the tears were operating independently, doing what they needed to do while the rest of her maintained her composure because that's what she'd learned to do. That's what being alone had taught her, that you could cry as long as you didn't let it change anything. Nayland sat down on the porch edge, her feet in the dirt, her back straight. She didn't reach for Clara, she didn't say anything. She just sat, present and solid and there, and I understood then what their friendship was, not a crossing of cultures or a defiance of the town's expectations, but something much simpler and much rarer. It was 2 women who had looked at each other's solitude and decided, without discussion, that it didn't have to be permanent. I sat on my barrel stool with my terrible cake and my ledger full of observations and the ring in my pocket, and I felt like an intruder, like I was witnessing something holy that I had no part in. Nayland looked at me, that same steady gaze from the road. She said something to Clara in Chiricahua, a few words, quiet, with a cadence that rose slightly at the end. A question, maybe. Clara wiped her face with the back of her hand, looked at Nayland, looked at me. Said something back in a mix of English and what I recognized as Chiricahua, broken, accented, but spoken with the familiarity of someone who'd been learning by sitting and listening, month after month on this porch. Nayland nodded. Then she looked at me again, and this time I saw something in her expression that I can only describe as assessment. She was measuring me, not with hostility, with the careful, unsentimental evaluation of someone who loves the woman sitting next to her and wants to know if the man on the barrel stool is worth a damn. I don't know what she saw, I don't know what test I passed or failed, but after a long moment she reached into the folds of her clothing and produced something small. She leaned across to me and held it out. It was a stone. Flat, round, reddish-brown, about the size of a silver dollar. One side was smooth, rubbed to a dull shine. The other side had a marking scratched into it, a simple shape, 2 lines meeting at a point. An arrowhead, maybe, or a mountain, or something that meant something I didn't have the language for. I took it. It was warm from being against her body. I held it in my palm and looked at Nayland, and she said one word, a Chiricahua word I didn't know, and then she stood up, touched Clara's shoulder once briefly, and walked back down the trail into the scrub. Clara watched her go, then she turned to me. "She likes you," Clara said. "How can you tell?" "She gave you a stone. She doesn't give people things." "What does the word mean?" "The one she said." Clara's mouth did something complicated, a smile that was also a challenge, a warmth that was also a warning. "It means stay." I looked down at the stone in my hand, then at the ring in my pocket, pressing against my thigh through the fabric, then at Clara Whitfield, sitting in her rocking chair on her weathered porch with tears still drying on her face and a pair of beaded moccasins in her lap, and the remnants of the worst cake ever baked sitting between us on a crate. "I intend to," I said. The rest of that morning unfolded in a way I don't fully trust my memory to reproduce accurately. Because when you've spent 2 years observing someone from a distance, and then suddenly find yourself in their kitchen washing dishes beside them, time does strange things. It stretches in some places and compresses in others, and you end up with vivid, crystalline moments surrounded by gaps you can't account for. I remember this. Clara showed me the ranch. Not the version visible from the ridge, the real one, the close-up one, with its patched fences and its stubborn cattle and its garden that was half miracle and half defiance. She walked me through it without apology, pointing out things she'd fixed, and things she couldn't fix, and things she'd given up on. And she did it with the matter-of-factness of someone who had long ago stopped trying to impress anyone and had settled for the more durable satisfaction of simply telling the truth. Her hands, I noticed, were never still. While she talked, they checked fence wire, pulled weeds, straightened a tool that was leaning wrong. Hands that had learned to work the way other people's hands learned to rest, automatically, without thought, because stillness was a luxury that had been taken from her along with everything else. I remember this. She asked about my ranch, and I told her, and somewhere in the telling I mentioned the ledger again, and she asked to see it, and I said no so fast that she laughed, the real laugh, the one I'd only seen from a distance. And I stood in her corral listening to it and understood for the first time why I'd been circling 3 times in pencil. I remember this. In the afternoon, the clouds came back, thick and dark, and the air got that heavy electric quality it gets before a desert storm, and Clara stood on her porch and looked at the sky and said, "Stay for dinner. The road will be bad." It was an excuse. We both knew it. The road would be fine. I'd ridden worse in worse weather. But she'd said stay, and Nayland had said stay, and the stone in my pocket was warm against my hand, and the ring was in the other pocket, and "Yes," I said. "I need to tell you about the evening, because the evening is where everything changed, and I need to get it right." Clara's kitchen at dusk was a different room than Clara's kitchen in the morning. The morning version was all efficiency, clean lines, labeled tins, the rifle by the door. The evening version was softer. She lit 2 oil lamps, one on the table and one on the shelf by the window, and the light they threw was amber and unsteady, and it made the small room feel like the inside of a lantern. The shadows moved. The walls breathed. The labeled tins became less like inventory and more like the artifacts of a life that someone was still, against considerable odds, living. She cooked. I sat at the table and watched, because she told me to sit, and I had learned in the last 8 hours that Clara Whitfield's instructions were not suggestions. She made beans, tortillas, and a kind of stew with dried beef and wild onions that Nayland had brought her. She moved around the kitchen the way a person moves through a sentence they've said 1,000 times, fluid, automatic, but with pauses in unexpected places, small hesitations that revealed the thinking underneath. I wrote in my ledger while she cooked. Not about her, not this time. I wrote about the kitchen. The way the lamp flame leaned when wind pressed against the window. The sound of tortillas on the iron skillet, a soft hiss, then a puff like the dough was sighing. The smell of the stew, which was richer than anything I'd eaten in months, maybe years, because I had been feeding myself the way you feed a machine, fuel, not food, and I'd forgotten that eating could be something other than maintenance. "What are you writing?" Clara asked, not turning from the stove. "The sound of your tortillas." She was quiet for a moment. Then, most men would be embarrassed to say that. Most men don't keep ledgers about tortilla sounds. No, they don't. She brought 2 plates to the table and sat across from me, and we ate. And the food was good, genuinely good, seasoned with something I couldn't identify that turned out to be a dried herb Nayland had taught her to find in the hills, and we talked. Not about big things. Not about loneliness or grief or the ridge or the 2 years I'd spent watching. About small things. About the mule, whose name was Judgment because of the way it looked at people. About the coyotes that had been coming closer this season. About the book on the porch. A novel, she said, the only one she owned, read so many times the spine was held together with thread and will. Dale never read, she said, not with bitterness, just as a fact. He wasn't against it. He just didn't see the point. He'd come in from the field and see me reading, and he'd look at me like I was doing something he couldn't quite understand. Like prayer, maybe. Something that made sense to other people. "What's the book?" She told me the title. I didn't recognize it, and I admitted this, and she said, "I'll lend it to you," and then immediately corrected herself, "No, I won't." You can read it here. Here, on this porch, in this kitchen. The word landed between us with the quiet weight of an invitation that was larger than a book. After dinner, we went back to the porch. The storm hadn't come. The clouds had thinned again, and now the sky was doing the thing it does in the territory when it can't decide what it wants, half dark, half light, with stars visible in one corner and the ghost of sunset still clinging to the other. The air smelled like creosote and rain that hadn't fallen. In the distance, lightning walked across the mountains, silent at this distance, just light without sound, like the sky was thinking. Clara sat in the rocking chair. I sat on the barrel. The remnants of the cake were still on the crate between us, and Clara reached over and broke off a piece and ate it, and I felt a surge of affection so intense it was almost painful. Caleb. Yes. Why did you come today? The real reason. Not just the birthday. I'd known this question was coming. I'd been preparing for it the way you prepare for a river crossing, checking the depth, the current, the footing, knowing that preparation only gets you to the edge, and after that it's just the water and you. I have something else, I said. I reached into my vest pocket. My fingers found the ring box, the small wooden box, smooth from years of sitting on a shelf, warm from being against my chest all day. I pulled it out and held it in my hand and looked at it and felt the full, terrifying weight of what I was about to do. This was my mother's, I said. My father gave it to her the year they married. She wore it every day. When she died, she told me to give it to someone who made me feel like the world had a point. Clara had gone very still. Not the stillness of surprise, a different kind. The kind that happens when someone is listening with every part of their body, when they've stopped breathing because breathing might interfere with hearing. You don't have to answer now, I said, and I could hear my own voice doing something unfamiliar, shaking in places it usually held steady. You don't have to answer ever if you don't want to, but I needed you to know. I needed to stop riding past. I opened the box. The ring sat in its fold of cloth, the turquoise catching the last light from the sky, and it was the color of her dresses, and it was the color of the stone Nayland had given me. And it was the color of something I hadn't let myself feel for so long that feeling it now was like blood returning to a limb that's been pressed too long, sharp, tingling, almost unbearable. Clara looked at the ring. She looked at it for a long time. Then she looked at me, and her face was doing something I'd never seen from the ridge, something no ledger entry could capture, something that was happening in real time, up close, undeniable. Her eyes were bright. Her jaw was set. Her hands, those hands that were never still, were gripping the arms of the rocking chair so hard her knuckles had gone white. Caleb Dunn, she said, I need to tell you something, and I need you to listen. I'm listening. I am not a woman who needs rescuing. I don't need someone to fix my fences or carry my water or tell me I'm not alone. I have been alone. I know what it is. I have survived it. I am surviving it. Do you understand? I understand. If you're here because you pity me, because poor Clara needs a man to make her life worth living, then you take that ring and you ride back to your ridge, and you write in your ledger that you tried and it didn't work. I will not hold it against you. I'm not here because I pity you. Then why? I thought about this. I thought about it carefully, because Clara deserved careful, and because the wrong answer would not just end this conversation, but would confirm every silent suspicion she'd held about people's motives for 2 years. Because you replaced your own porch post, I said. Because you taught yourself Chiricahua from sitting on a porch. Because you keep a garden in soil that doesn't want one. Because you read a book so many times it fell apart and you sewed it back together. Because you stopped on a hill in March with your water yoke, and I couldn't tell if you'd given up or if you were just looking at the sky, and either way I wanted to be the person standing next to you. The rocking chair creaked. Clara was rocking now, a slow, small motion, barely a movement at all. The kind of rocking people do when they're working through something that's too big to sit still with. You wanted to stand next to me while I looked at the sky, she repeated. Yes. That's not a proposal, Caleb, that's... She stopped, pressed her fingers to the side of her neck again, that gesture I'd seen from the porch, the pulse check, the am I real check. That's something better than a proposal. I have the ring if you want the proposal too. She laughed, the real laugh. The one I'd seen from the ridge, the one that had changed the way I understood her. And then she was crying again, the same quiet tears from that morning, the ones that came independently of the rest of her, and she was laughing and crying at the same time. And I sat on my barrel stool and felt my own eyes burn and blinked hard because I had not cried in front of another person since I was 11 years old, and I was not about to start now, except that I was. Because the sound of Clara Whitfield laughing and crying simultaneously on her porch on her birthday that nobody had remembered was the most human sound I had ever heard, and it broke something in me that had needed breaking for a very long time. "Put it on the crate," she said, wiping her face. "Between the flowers and the cake, let me look at it." I put the ring box on the crate. The turquoise stone sat among the yellow and purple wildflowers Nayland had brought, and the crumbled remains of the cake I'd baked, and the fading light from a sky that had finally decided to go dark. "Let me look at it," Clara said again, "while I think. Take as long as you need." "I need tonight. Then I'll go." "You'll stay on the porch," she said. "In the chair you'll stay, and in the morning I'll tell you." I looked at her, she looked at me. The lightning still walked the mountains in the distance, silent and bright, and somewhere in the scrub a nightjar began its call, a low, churring sound, like a wheel turning in the dark. "All right," I said. I did not sleep. I sat in the barrel stool. She'd taken the rocking chair inside, which I understood was a practical decision and not a commentary on my character. And I wrapped myself in a horse blanket I'd pulled from my saddle, and I stared at the dark, and I listened to the territory do what the territory does at night. Coyotes distant, their calls rising and falling in that cascading, unhinged way that sounds like laughter if you're feeling generous and like grief if you're not. The wind through the scrub, dry and constant, carrying the smell of dust and sage. The occasional stamp and snort of my horse in the corral, keeping judgment company. The sound of the house settling, wood contracting as the temperature dropped, small creaks and pops that sounded like a conversation between the boards. At some point, I don't know when time had lost its meaning, I heard Clara moving inside. Not coming to the door, just moving, walking from one end of the cabin to the other, back and forth, the particular rhythm of someone pacing. I'd done it myself many nights. The walking to think. The wearing of a path between the bed and the window and back again, as if the answer to whatever question you're carrying might be hidden in the floorboards. I took out the stone Nayland had given me, held it in the dark, ran my thumb over the smooth side, then the scratched side, feeling the lines of the mark, the arrowhead, the mountain, whatever it was. Stay. She'd said it like an instruction, but also like a prediction. As if she'd seen something in me that I hadn't seen in myself, and was simply telling me what I was going to do, the way you'd tell a river which way to flow. I opened my ledger, wrote by feel in the dark, which meant the handwriting would be illegible, but the act of writing mattered more than the result. August 6th, night, on Clara's porch, she is deciding. I brought a cake, a ring, and myself, and I am suddenly aware that two of those things were insufficient and one of them might be enough, and I don't know which is which. The coyotes are close tonight. I can hear her walking. I closed the ledger, held it against my chest, felt the leather cover, warm from my body, full of years of observations and almosts and should-haves, and I thought about what it would mean if she said no. It would mean riding back to the ridge, writing it down, adding it to the column of nothings, the silences, the times I should have spoken sooner or different or better. It would mean the ledger getting another entry that started with, "I should have." And I realized, sitting there in the dark, that the ledger had become the problem. Somewhere along the way, writing things down had become a substitute for living them. The act of observation had replaced the act of participation. I'd been keeping a record of a life I wasn't in, documenting the world from the outside with the meticulousness of someone who believed that watching was the same as being present. It wasn't, I knew that now. I'd known it for a long time, but knowing and acting are separated by a gap that most people like me, the quiet ones, the watchers, the ones who sit on ridges, never cross. I'd crossed it today, with a cake and a ring and a sentence that came out before I could stop it. And now I was sitting in the dark, waiting, and the waiting was terrible and also the most alive I'd felt in years. Dawn came the way desert dawns do, fast, brutal, and without apology. One moment the sky was dark, and the next it was gray, and then pink, and then gold, and the mountains went from black silhouettes to red and ochre monuments, and the temperature rose, and the quail started up, and Judgment the mule began making sounds that suggested breakfast was overdue. I was stiff. My back had opinions about the barrel stool that it expressed through a series of pops and protests when I stood. My eyes felt sandy. My mouth tasted like regret and cake residue. The door opened. Clara came out carrying 2 cups of coffee. She handed me one without speaking. She was wearing a different dress, still blue, but a deeper shade, one I'd never seen from the ridge. She'd pinned her hair differently, or maybe it was the same, and I was just seeing it at a distance of 3 feet instead of 3 miles. She sat in a chair she'd brought out, a kitchen chair, not the rocker, and she sat across from me and drank her coffee and looked at the mountains and said nothing. The ring box was still on the crate. The turquoise stone caught the new light and burned blue-green against the faded wildflowers. I drank my coffee. It was better than mine. Everything she made was better than mine. This was not a useful thought, so I wrote it in my head and filed it in the mental ledger I kept for things too petty for ink. Caleb. Yes. I walked all night. I heard. I thought about Dale. About what it was like to be married to a man who loved me but didn't see me. About what it would be like to be married again. About whether I was saying yes because I wanted to or because I was tired of being alone, and whether there was a difference. I held my coffee, didn't drink, didn't breathe. There's a difference, she said. I figured that out around 3 in the morning. Wanting someone is not the same as not wanting to be alone. One is about them, the other is about you. Which one is this? She looked at me, those dark eyes with the ember flecks, the scar on her hand, the lines at her eyes that deepened when she was thinking and softened when she wasn't. You wrote down the sound of my tortillas, she said. You baked a cake that tasted like a drought. You rode past my ranch every morning for 2 years and never stopped because you were afraid, and you stopped today because you were more afraid of not stopping. You told me you wanted to stand next to me while I looked at the sky. She reached across the crate and picked up the ring box, held it in both hands, looked at the turquoise. This is about you, she said, specifically you. Your particular, peculiar, ledger-keeping, ridge-riding, terrible cake-baking self. Is that a yes? It's not a yes to the ring, not yet. My heart did something that resembled falling from a horse. A lurch, a suspension, a bracing for impact. It's a yes to the promise, she said. The promise. You said you'd stop riding past. You said you intended to stay. That's a promise, Caleb. And I've learned that promises mean more than rings. Rings are metal. Promises are what you do every morning when it's easier not to. She held the box out to me. I took it. The turquoise looked different in the morning light, less like her dresses, more like the stone Nayland had given me. I looked at it and felt something complicated that I would later spend 3 pages of ledger space trying to articulate and never quite manage. Keep the ring, Clara said. Bring it back when you've earned it. How do I earn it? Stop every morning, don't ride past. Come down from the ridge, have coffee, help with the fence if it needs it, and don't help if it doesn't. Bring your ledger, read it to me. Let me see the parts you're ashamed of. Let me see the should-haves. I held the ring box, felt the weight of it different now. Not the weight of a proposal, but the weight of a contract. A daily, ordinary, unromantic contract that had nothing to do with gold and turquoise and everything to do with showing up. And if I do that? I asked. Then we'll see. She took a sip of coffee, looked at the mountains. We'll see. I rode home that morning on a road I'd traveled 100 times, but it looked different. The scrub was the same scrub. The dust was the same dust. My horse was the same horse, moving with the same patient plod of an animal that had no opinion about human emotional milestones. But I was different. I could feel it the way you feel a bone that's been reset, the same structure, the same shape, but something fundamental shifted into place, painful and right. At the junction where the hill trail met the main road, I stopped. Nayland was not there. But on a flat stone at the side of the road, placed carefully, deliberately, in a spot where it couldn't be missed, was a small bundle of blue wildflowers tied with a strip of deerskin. I looked at them for a long time. Then I dismounted, picked them up, and tucked them into my saddlebag beside the empty cake cloth and the ring box and the stone. At home, I put the flowers in a jar of water on my kitchen table. I fed the horse. I checked the herd. I did all the things I always did in the order I always did them, and it was the same and it was not the same. Then I sat down at the table and opened the ledger. I turned past the should-haves, past the nothings, past the circled and underlined birthday entry to a fresh page. I wrote the date. And then I wrote something I had never written before. Not an observation, not a record, not a note about someone else's life viewed from a safe distance. I wrote a plan. Do not ride past, do not ride past, do not. I stopped writing, put the pen down, looked at the jar of blue wildflowers on my table and the ring box on the shelf and the stone from Nayland beside my coffee pot. 3 gifts from 3 people on one day. A stone that meant stay. A flower that meant I didn't know what it meant. Maybe nothing, maybe everything. And a word from Clara that wasn't yes and wasn't no, but was something more honest than either. We'll see. I closed the ledger. The next morning, I rode down from the ridge. Not past, not along, down. Straight through the gate, past the mule, to the porch where Clara was sitting with 2 cups of coffee already poured, as if she'd known. As if she'd been counting on it. Morning, I said. Morning, she said. She handed me the cup. I sat on the barrel stool. The wildflowers from Nayland were in the jar on the crate, fresh ones, newly placed. The cake crumbs were gone. The spot where the ring box had sat was empty, just a faint circle in the dust on the crate's surface. We drank coffee. We watched the sun come up over the mountains. Judgment the mule stared at us with ancient, unflinching skepticism. The south fence needs work, Clara said. I noticed. You noticed from the ridge. I did. Show me your ledger. I hesitated, my hands tightened around the cup. The ledger was in my saddlebag, where I'd put it this morning with the deliberate, stomach-churning intention of doing exactly what she'd asked, letting her see it. All of it. The observations and the admissions and the 3 in the morning entries that read like letters to someone I'd been too afraid to send them to. It's not, I started. Caleb, it's embarrassing. Good, bring it here. I brought it. She opened it on the crate between the wildflowers and the coffee cups, and she began to read. I sat beside her and watched her face and felt the particular agony of being truly seen. Not from a ridge, not through a window, not from the careful distance I'd maintained around every person I'd ever known, but here on a porch in the morning, with the ink still fresh on some of the pages. She read slowly. Her finger traced the lines. Occasionally she paused and looked at me with an expression I was learning to recognize, not pity, not amusement, but a kind of tender exasperation, the look you give someone who has been doing something both foolish and beautiful for a very long time and has only just realized it. She got to the entry about the hill, the water yoke, the stopping. I was looking at a hawk, she said quietly, that day on the hill. There was a red-tailed hawk riding a thermal over the wash, and it was the most graceful thing I'd seen in months, and I stopped to watch it because for about 30 seconds watching that hawk, I forgot that everything was hard. I looked at her, she looked at me. You wrote that it was the saddest thing you'd ever seen, she said. It looked sad from the ridge. It wasn't sad, it was a woman watching a hawk. I know that now. She closed the ledger, placed her hand flat on the cover, held it there. Come back tomorrow, she said. I will. And the day after. Yes. And stop writing about me from a distance. If you want to know what I'm thinking, ask me. If you want to know what I'm feeling, she paused, her hand pressed harder on the ledger. Ask me, I am right here. I have been right here the whole time. I reached over and put my hand on top of hers, on top of the ledger, on top of 2 years of watching and writing and being afraid, and all the mornings I'd ridden past, and all the entries that started with I should have, and the particular long ache of wanting someone from a distance that you maintain because closeness is the thing that can actually hurt you. Her hand turned under mine, our fingers laced together. The ledger sat beneath them, closed, its record complete, not finished, but complete in the way a foundation is complete before you build the house. Happy birthday, Clara, I said, a day late, a year late, 2 years late. She squeezed my hand. The mule snorted, the quail called, the sun finished rising.